The ship was dying, could feel it in her bones as the walls shook and the lights flickered red. Warning alarms screamed through the corridors of the stellar vanguard, and smoke poured from broken pipes above her head. She ran through the narrow hallways, her boots slipping on the metal floor as the ship tilted hard to one side. "All crew to escape pods," the captain's voice crackled through the speakers. "This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." Did not need to be told twice. She had been a lieutenant in the Space Corps for 6 years, and she knew the sound of a dying ship. The engines had failed somewhere over an uncharted planet, and now gravity was pulling them down like a stone sinking in water. There was no time to think. There was only time to run. She reached the escape pod bay just as another explosion rocked the ship. The force threw her against the wall and pain shot through her shoulder, but she pushed herself up and kept moving. 3 pods had already launched. 2 more were damaged beyond use, their doors hanging open like broken mouths. Only 1 pod remained. Climbed inside and slammed her palm against the launch button. The door sealed shut with a hiss, and then she was thrown back into her seat as the pod shot away from the ship. Through the small window, she watched the stellar vanguard break apart in the atmosphere. Fire consumed it, turning the ship into a ball of orange light that fell toward the white surface below. She was alone. The pod's computer spoke in a calm voice that felt wrong for the situation. Entering atmosphere of uncharted planet. Surface temperature, -58 degrees. Atmosphere, breathable, landing in approximately 4 minutes. Gripped the armrests and stared out the window. The planet below was nothing but ice and snow. Mountains rose like white teeth against a gray sky, and endless plains of frozen ground stretched in every direction. There were no cities, no lights, no signs of life at all. The pod hit the ground hard. Its head snapped forward, and for a moment everything went black. When she opened her eyes again, the pod was tilted at an angle, half buried in snow. Cold air was already seeping through cracks in the hull. She checked herself for injuries. Her shoulder hurt and there was a cut on her forehead, but nothing was broken. She was alive. That was more than she had expected. Opened the emergency supply compartment and took stock of what she had. 1 thermal jacket with heating cells. 1 damaged communication unit that flickered when she turned it on. 3 days of food rations. A small medical kit. A flashlight. That was all. She put on the thermal jacket and felt the warmth spread across her body. The heating cells hummed softly against her skin. Without this jacket, she knew she would die within hours in this cold. It was her most important possession now. The communication unit crackled with static when she tried to send a distress signal. "This is Lieutenant Park of the Stellar Vanguard," she said into the device. "My ship has crashed on an uncharted ice planet, requesting immediate rescue. Does anyone copy?" Only static answered her. She tried again and again, but the signal was too weak. The planet's atmosphere was interfering with the transmission. Maybe it would get through, maybe it would not. She had no way to know. Looked out through the cracked window of the pod. The wind was picking up, throwing snow against the glass in white sheets. A blizzard was coming. She could not stay in the pod. It offered no real protection from the cold, and if the storm buried it completely, she would be trapped inside like a frozen coffin. She needed to find shelter. Stepped out into the cold and the wind hit her like a fist. Even with the thermal jacket, she could feel the ice in the air trying to reach her skin. She pulled her hood up and started walking toward the mountains. Caves, she thought. There had to be caves in those rocks. Somewhere she could hide from the wind. The walk was harder than anything she had ever done. The snow came up to her knees and every step felt like lifting weights. The wind pushed against her, trying to knock her down. Her face went numb within minutes and frost began to form on her eyelashes. But she kept moving. Stopping meant dying and was not ready to die. After 2 hours she saw it, a dark opening in the side of the mountain, a cave. Pushed herself forward with the last of her strength. She stumbled through the entrance and collapsed on the cold stone floor. The wind still howled outside, but in here it could not reach her. She had found shelter. She lay there for a long moment, catching her breath. Her body was shaking from cold and exhaustion, but she was alive. She had made it. Then she heard the sound. It was soft at first, a whimper like a child crying in the dark. Froze, her heart suddenly beating fast in her chest. She was not alone in this cave. Slowly she reached for her flashlight and turned it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the stone walls of the cave, the frozen ground, the icicles hanging from the ceiling. And there, in the deepest corner, three small shapes huddled together. His breath caught in her throat. They were creatures unlike anything she had seen before. Small, about the size of cats, with silver-blue fur that looked thin and matted. They had large eyes that reflected her flashlight beam like mirrors, and long tails wrapped around each other for warmth. They were shaking badly, their small bodies pressed together in a desperate attempt to stay warm. They were children, cubs, and they were terrified. When the light hit them, they cried out in fear. High, keening sounds that echoed off the cave walls. They pressed themselves against the stone, trying to get away from her, but there was nowhere for them to go. Did not move. She barely breathed. Her survival training told her to leave. Unknown alien creatures could be dangerous. Their parents might return and attack her. Every protocol she had learned said to find another shelter and avoid contact. But she could not look away from those eyes. Those big, frightened, desperate eyes that reminded her of every scared child she had ever seen. They were cold. They were hungry. They were alone. Just like her. The darkness inside the cave was heavy and thick. Sat very still on the cold stone floor, listening to the small creature's whimper in the corner. Outside, the blizzard screamed like an angry beast, throwing snow and ice against the mountain. But inside, there was only the sound of frightened breathing. Waited, she did not move. She did not speak. She just sat there, letting the creatures get used to her presence. She remembered something her grandmother had told her long ago when she was a child trying to befriend a stray cat in their neighborhood. Scared things need time, her grandmother had said. You cannot rush trust. You can only offer it and wait. So waited. After a long while, the whimpering grew softer. The creatures were still afraid, but they were also tired. Could hear their breathing slow down, could sense their bodies relaxing just a little bit. They were watching her in the dark, trying to understand what she was. Slowly, very slowly, reached into her pocket and pulled out a protein bar from her rations. The wrapper crinkled in the silence, and she heard the creatures tense up again. She stopped moving and waited until they calmed down. Then she carefully opened the wrapper and broke off a small piece of the bar. The smell of food filled the cold air. Heard one of the creatures sniff, then another. They were hungry. She could tell by the way their bodies leaned forward even as their fear held them back. Placed the piece of protein bar on the ground in front of her. Then she pulled her hand back and waited. Nothing happened for a long time. The creatures stayed in their corner, watching her with those big reflective eyes. Did not push. She did not try to get closer. She just sat there, the cold seeping through her clothes and into her bones. Then finally, one of them moved. It was the smallest one, barely bigger than its hand, with fur that was thinner than the others. It crept forward on shaking legs, its belly low to the ground, ready to run at the first sign of danger. Its siblings made small, worried sounds, but the little one kept coming. It reached the piece of protein bar and sniffed it carefully. Then, in one quick motion, it grabbed the food in its mouth and ran back to the corner. The other two gathered around it and heard the sounds of them eating together, sharing the small piece between them. Smiled in the darkness. "Good," she whispered, "that's good." She broke off another piece and placed it a little closer to herself this time. Again, the smallest one came forward. But this time, it did not run away so fast. It stood there for a moment, looking at with its head tilted to one side. Then it grabbed the food and returned to its siblings. They did this again and again. Each time placed the food a little closer. Each time the smallest creature came a little nearer. After a while, the other two started coming forward too. They were still scared, but hunger was stronger than fear. By the time it had given away half of her protein bar, the three creatures were eating from the ground right in front of her. She could see them clearly now in the dim light that came from the cave entrance. Their fur was a beautiful silver-blue color, like moonlight on snow. Their eyes were large and round, with pupils that changed size as they looked at her. Their ears were tall and pointed, twitching at every sound. They were thin, too thin, could see their ribs showing beneath their matted fur. They had been starving for days, maybe longer. Where was their mother? Where were the adults of their kind? Had something happened to them? Did not know the answers. All she knew was that these three small creatures were alone and hungry and cold, just like her. The smallest one finished eating and looked up at. It made a soft chirping sound, almost like a question. Slowly extended her hand, palm up, letting the creature see that she meant no harm. The small one sniffed her fingers. Its nose was cold and wet against her skin. Then, to surprise, it pressed its head against her palm, seeking warmth. Something broke inside's chest. A wall she had built around her heart, the wall that soldiers were taught to keep up, the wall that kept emotions from getting in the way of survival. It crumbled in that moment, with that small creature pressing against her hand. "Hey there," said softly. "It's okay, I'm not going to hurt you." The other two creatures watched carefully. They saw their sibling touching the strange being, saw that nothing bad was happening. Slowly, carefully, they crept forward too. Within minutes, all three of them were huddled against its legs. She could feel their small bodies shaking with cold. Their fur offered almost no protection against the freezing temperatures. They were meant for warmer places, she realized. Something had driven them into this cave, into this cold that was killing them slowly. Looked down at the three small lives pressed against her, and she felt something she had not felt in a long time: purpose. On her ship, she had been one officer among many, important but replaceable. Here, she was all these creatures had. Without her, they would die. She gently stroked the head of the smallest one. It closed its eyes and made a sound like a purr. The other two pressed closer, seeking the same comfort. "I don't know what you are," said quietly. "I don't know where your family is. I don't know if you can understand me. But I promise you this, I will not leave you. Whatever happens, we face it together." The creatures could not understand her words, but perhaps they understood her tone, or the gentle touch of her hands, or the warmth of her body. They stopped shaking so much. They stopped whimpering. They just stayed close to her, trusting her in a way that made his heart ache. Outside, the blizzard continued to rage. The temperature was dropping fast, and knew the worst of the cold was yet to come. Night was falling on this frozen world, and with it would come a cold so deep it could kill in minutes. She looked at her thermal jacket, felt the warmth of the heating cells against her skin. Then she looked at the three small creatures huddled against her, their thin fur offering no protection, their small bodies burning through energy they did not have just to stay alive. Knew what she had to do. She had known it from the moment she first saw them in the darkness of the cave. The choice had already been made. All that remained was the action. But not yet. Not until she had to. For now she held them close and tried to share what warmth as the light outside the cave faded quickly. What little gray sky could see through the entrance turned dark, and the blizzard grew stronger. The wind now sounded like screaming, high and terrible, as if the planet itself was angry at everything that lived upon it. Inside the cave, the cold became something alive. It crept along the walls like a creature. It sank into the stone floor. It wrapped around and the three small cubs like invisible hands made of ice. Even with her thermal jacket, felt the cold pressing against her, trying to find a way in. She checked the jacket's power display. The heating cells were running low. They had maybe 6 more hours of warmth left, and the night would last much longer than that. Did the math in her head and felt fear settle in her stomach like a stone. The cubs noticed the change too. As the temperature dropped, they began to shake again. Their small bodies pressed harder against legs, seeking warmth that was not there. The smallest one made a sound that broke's heart. It was not a cry of fear. It was a cry of pain. The cold was hurting them. Pulled them closer, but it was not enough. She could feel how thin they were, how little protection their fur offered. They were creatures of a warmer world, lost in a frozen nightmare. Without help, they would not survive the night. She thought about her situation. Rescue might come in 2 days, maybe 3. The distress signal might have gotten through, or it might not have. There was no way to know. All she could do was survive until help arrived. But survival was not just about her anymore. Look down at the 3 cubs. The smallest one had stopped moving. Its eyes were half closed and its breathing was shallow. It was giving up. It was letting the cold take it because fighting was too hard. "No," said firmly. "No, you don't get to quit." She picked up the small creature and held it against her chest, inside her jacket, against her warm skin. The cub was so cold it felt like holding ice. But slowly, it began to warm up. Its eyes opened again. It made a weak chirping sound and pressed its tiny face against its neck. The other 2 cubs cried out, reaching toward their sibling, reaching toward the warmth. They were freezing too. They needed the same thing, but could not hold all 3 of them inside her jacket. There was not enough room. She sat there in the darkness, holding one dying cub while the other 2 slowly froze, and she knew that she had to make a choice. Her thermal jacket could save them. If she wrapped all 3 of them in it, the heating cells would keep them warm through the night. They would survive. They would live. But without the jacket would die. She thought about her life, her family back on Earth who she had not seen in 2 years, her friends on the ship who were probably all dead now, her career, her dreams, her future. Everything she had worked for, everything she had hoped for, all of it would end here in this frozen cave if she gave away her jacket. The smallest cub looked up at her with those big, trusting eyes. It chirped softly, as if asking a question it did not have words for. Felt tears forming in her eyes. They froze on her cheeks before they could fall. "Okay," she whispered, "okay." She carefully set the smallest cub down with its siblings. Then, with shaking hands, she unzipped her thermal jacket and took it off. The cold hit her like a hammer. It drove the breath from her lungs and made her muscles lock up. It was so much worse than she had expected, so much worse than anything she had ever felt. The cold did not creep into her body. It rushed in, filling every part of her with ice. But she did not stop. Spread the jacket on the ground and placed all 3 cubs on top of it. Then she wrapped it around them like a blanket, making sure every part of them was covered. The jacket's heating cells hummed against their small bodies, and she saw them relax almost immediately. The shaking stopped. The crying stopped. They huddled together under the warm fabric, and one by one, they closed their eyes and fell asleep. Watched them for a long moment. Despite everything, despite the cold that was already spreading through her body, she smiled. They were safe. They would live. That was all that mattered. She leaned back against the cave wall and wrapped her arms around herself. Her body was shaking so hard she could barely think. The cold was everywhere now, in her fingers and toes, in her chest, in her head. She could feel her heart slowing down as her body tried to conserve heat. She knew what was happening, hypothermia. Her core temperature was dropping. Soon she would stop shaking. Then she would feel warm even though she was freezing to death. Then she would fall asleep and never wake up. Did not regret her choice. Not for a single moment. She had spent her whole life following rules, following orders, doing what she was told. But this choice had been hers alone. She had chosen to save 3 small lives instead of her own, and that choice felt more real and more right than anything she had ever done. The hours passed slowly, drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind growing foggy and confused. She dreamed of warm places, her grandmother's kitchen, a beach on Earth where she had played as a child, the engine room of her ship where the machines gave off heat that made the air thick and heavy. Sometimes she woke up and saw the cubs sleeping peacefully under her jacket. Sometimes she heard them making soft sounds in their sleep, little chirps and purrs that sounded happy. That made her smile, even though smiling hurt. At some point during the night, she stopped shaking. She knew that was a bad sign, but she was too tired to care. The cold did not hurt anymore. It felt almost peaceful, like sinking into a soft bed after a long day. She looked at the cubs one last time. They were warm. They were alive. That was enough. Closed her eyes and let the darkness take her. Her last thought was not of fear or sadness. It was of those three small creatures, safe and warm because of her. It was the thought of something good done in a universe that often felt cold and empty. Captain had seen many terrible things in his 20 years of service. He had seen ships explode in the darkness of space. He had seen planets burn. He had seen good soldiers die in bad places for reasons that made no sense. But nothing had prepared him for what he found in that frozen cave on an uncharted ice planet. The rescue team had been searching for survivors since dawn. The distress signal from the stellar vanguard had been weak and broken, but it had gotten through, had brought 3 shuttles and 30 soldiers to search the crash site. They found only wreckage and bodies, no survivors, until the scanners picked up a faint heat signature in the mountains. "Could be nothing," said Lieutenant Minyu, second in command. "Could be a thermal vent or some kind of geological activity." "Or it could be someone who needs our help," replied. "We check it out." They found the cave after 2 hours of climbing through snow and ice. The blizzard had stopped, but the cold was still terrible. Even in their heated combat suits, the soldiers felt it pressing against them, trying to get in. Was the first one through the cave entrance. He turned on his helmet light and swept it across the darkness inside. What he saw made him stop so suddenly that Minyu crashed into his back. In the deepest corner of the cave, a woman lay against the wall. She was not moving. Her skin was blue-white and frost covered her hair like a crown of ice. She wore no jacket, no protective gear, just a thin uniform that offered no protection against the cold. She should have been dead. By all logic, she should have been frozen solid hours ago. But she was not alone. 3 small creatures lay beside her, wrapped in a thermal jacket that still hummed with fatting warmth. They were pressed against her body, as if trying to share their heat with her. Their silver-blue fur was matted but clean, and their eyes were closed in peaceful sleep. "What in the name of?" Minyu began, but held up his hand for silence. He approached slowly, carefully. The woman's eyes were closed, but he could see her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. She was alive. Barely, impossibly, stubbornly alive. "Medical team," shouted, "get in here now." The next few minutes were chaos. Soldiers rushed into the cave with heating blankets and medical equipment. They tried to take the jacket from the creatures to give it back to the woman, but her hand shot out and grabbed arm with surprising strength. Her eyes were open now, but they were unfocused, confused. She did not seem to know where she was or what was happening, but her grip was strong and her voice was clear. "The cubs first," she said through cracked, frozen lips. "Warm them first." Looked at her for a long moment, then he nodded. "You heard her," he said to his team. "Take care of the creatures first." They wrapped the 3 cubs in a separate heating blanket and checked them for injuries. They were weak and malnourished, but they were alive and healthy. Whatever the woman had done, it had worked. She had saved them. Then they turned their attention to her. Her body temperature was dangerously low. Her fingers and toes showed signs of severe frostbite. She had been minutes away from death when they found her, maybe less. As the medical team worked to stabilize her, knelt beside her and looked into her eyes. "Lieutenant Park," he said, reading her name from her uniform. "Can you hear me? Can you tell me what happened?" Tried to speak, but her voice was too weak. Instead, she just looked toward the cubs, making sure they were safe. When she saw them wrapped in blankets being carried gently by the soldiers, she smiled. It was a small smile, barely visible on her frozen face, but it was there. "You gave them your jacket," said. It was not a question. He had already figured out what had happened. "You gave them your only protection against the cold." Closed her eyes and nodded slightly. She was too tired to explain. Felt something strange in his chest. In all his years of service, he had never seen anything like this. A soldier giving up their survival gear to save alien creatures they had never seen before. It was against every protocol, against every rule of survival they were taught, and it was the most human thing he had ever witnessed. They were preparing to carry out of the cave when the soldier at the entrance shouted a warning. "Movement outside. Something big is approaching." Grabbed his weapon and moved to the cave entrance. What he saw made him freeze in place. A creature was walking toward them through the snow. It was huge, easily 3 meters tall, covered in silver-blue fur that shimmered in the pale light. It moved on 4 legs, each one as thick as a tree trunk. Its eyes were large and intelligent, the same shape as the cub's eyes, just much, much bigger. It was the mother, it had to be. "Weapons ready," Minyu shouted. The soldiers formed a line at the cave entrance, their guns aimed at the approaching creature. But before anyone could fire, a weak voice called out from inside the cave. No had pulled herself up to a sitting position, supported by a medic. Her face was pale and her body was shaking, but her voice was clear. "Don't hurt her. She's their mother. She came back for them." Held up his hand. "Hold fire, everyone hold fire." The mother creature stopped a few meters from the cave entrance. She did not attack. She did not run. She just stood there, looking past the soldiers to the inside of the cave where her cubs were lying. For a long moment, nothing happened. The soldiers held their weapons ready. The creature stood perfectly still. The only sound was the wind and its labored breathing. Then the medic carrying the cubs stepped forward. Slowly, carefully, he walked past the line of soldiers and approached the mother. He held out the bundle of cubs, wrapped in their heating blanket, and offered them to her. The mother lowered her great head and sniffed her children. She made a sound that was clearly relief, clearly love. Then she gently took the blanket in her mouth and lifted the cubs against her chest. But she did not leave. Instead, she turned and looked into the cave. Her eyes found this small, frozen, dying human who had saved her children. For a long moment they just looked at each other. Human and alien, stranger and stranger. Then the mother did something that made every soldier gasp. She bowed her great head, low and deep, in a gesture that needed no translation. It was respect. It was gratitude. It was a thank you that crossed the gap between species and said what words could never say. Smiled again, tears freezing on her cheeks. "Take care of them," she whispered. The mother turned and walked away into the snow, her cubs safe against her chest. Watched her go, then looked back at. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "you just made first contact with an alien species." Laughed weakly. "I just didn't want them to be cold," she said. And then she passed out. The hospital ship Mercy floated in orbit above the ice planet, its white hull glowing softly against the darkness of space. Inside, in a small room filled with humming machines and warm light, Park opened her eyes for the first time in 3 days. At first, she did not know where she was. The ceiling above her was smooth and gray, and the air smelled like medicine and recycled oxygen. She tried to move, but her body felt heavy and strange. There were tubes connected to her arms and sensors attached to her chest. She could hear the steady beep of a heart monitor somewhere nearby. "Easy there, Lieutenant." A gentle voice came from beside her bed, turned her head and saw a young nurse named sitting in a chair nearby. "You've been through a lot. Don't try to move too fast." His throat was dry, but she managed to speak. "The cubs," she whispered. "Are they okay?" Smiled. "They're fine. Their mother took them home. You saved their lives, Lieutenant." Closed her eyes and felt relief wash through her body like warm water. They were safe. That was all that mattered. Over the next few days, slowly recovered. The doctors told her she was lucky to be alive. Her core temperature had dropped to levels that should have killed her. She had suffered severe frostbite and lost 2 fingers on her left hand. But somehow, against all odds, she had survived. Your body just refused to give up, the chief doctor told her. I've never seen anything like it. It's like you were too stubborn to die. Thought about those long hours in the cave, holding on for one more minute, then one more after that. She had not been holding on for herself. She had been holding on for 3 small creatures who needed her. Maybe that was what had kept her alive. Maybe having something worth living for made death harder to accept. When she was strong enough to sit up, Captain came to visit her. He sat in the chair beside her bed and looked at her with an expression she could not read. "You've become famous, Lieutenant," he said. "The story of what you did has spread across every ship in the fleet. Everyone is talking about the woman who gave away her jacket to save alien children." Shook her head. "I didn't do anything special. Anyone would have done the same thing." Was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No, they wouldn't have. I've been a soldier for 20 years. I've seen what people do when they're desperate and afraid. They think of themselves first. That's not wrong, that's just survival. But you," he paused, searching for the right words. "You looked at 3 creatures you'd never seen before, creatures who could have been dangerous, who offered you nothing in return, and you gave them everything you had. That's not normal, Lieutenant. That's something else." Did not know what to say. She had never thought of herself as special or brave or anything other than ordinary. She had just done what felt right in the moment. She could not have left those cubs to freeze. It was not a choice. It was just who she was. 3 months passed. Returned to duty with a prosthetic hand and a medal she never asked for. She tried to go back to normal life, to forget about the ice planet and the cave and the 3 small creatures who had changed everything. But the universe had other plans. A message came from the planet's surface. The creatures, whose scientists had named wanted to make contact with humans, and they had asked for by name. She returned to the ice planet on a diplomatic shuttle, surrounded by politicians and scientists and soldiers. The cold no longer bothered her as much as it once had. She had survived worse. The mother was waiting for her at the entrance to a great ice structure that served as their city. She was even more beautiful than remembered, her silver-blue fur gleaming in the pale light, her intelligent eyes watching everything with calm curiosity. Beside her stood 3 young. They were bigger now, stronger and healthier. Their fur was thick and shiny, and they moved with the energy of children everywhere. When they saw, they made excited chirping sounds and ran toward her. Knelt in the snow as the 3 young surrounded her, pressing their heads against her hands, her legs, her chest. They remembered her. After all this time, they still remembered the strange creature who had kept them warm in the dark. Felt tears forming in her eyes, but this time they did not freeze. The city was warmer than the mountains, and she could cry without fear. "Hello, little ones," she whispered. "I missed you too." The mother approached slowly and stood before. The translators that the scientists had built crackled with static, struggling to convert the language into human words. When the mother spoke, her voice was deep and musical, like wind chimes made of ice. "We have watched many species cross the stars," the mother said through the translator. "They come with weapons, they come with demands, they come seeking what they can take, but your kind is different." Stood up, her prosthetic hand resting on the head of the smallest cub. "I don't understand," she said. The mother's eyes were soft with something that looked like affection. "A human woman crashed alone on our world. She was freezing and starving. She had barely enough to survive. And when she found our young dying in the cold, she gave them everything she had. She expected nothing in return. She did not even know if we could think or speak." The mother stepped closer and felt the warmth of her great body against the cold air. "That is why we trust humans," the mother said. "Not because you are strong, not because you are clever, But because when your people find something small and helpless and cold, your first instinct is to give it your warmth, even if it means you freeze. Thought about all the history of her species, the wars and the cruelty and the terrible things humans had done to each other and to the worlds they had found. She thought about how easy it was to see humanity as violent and selfish and afraid. But that was not the whole story. That was never the whole story. Humans could be cruel, yes, but they could also be kind. They could be selfish, but they could also give everything they had to help a stranger. They could be afraid, but they could also face their fear and choose love anyway. That was what they had seen in that night in the cave. Not the worst of humanity, but the best. The part of humans that looked at something suffering and could not walk away. The part that gave away their last jacket to keep a stranger's children warm. The Galactic Council would later call it the greatest diplomatic success in human history. The Alliance opened doors to technologies and star maps that humans could never have discovered alone. It changed everything. But it was never about politics or diplomacy or the future of humanity. It was about three small creatures quivering in a cold cave, and a choice she made without thinking. She had given them her jacket, she had almost died. And she would do it again in a heartbeat. Because that was what it meant to be human, not the technology or the conquests or the empires among the stars. It was simpler than that, smaller, warmer. It was looking at something cold and helpless and saying, "I will keep you warm, whatever it costs." That was humanity. That was what made them worth knowing. That was what made them worth trusting. And Park, the woman who gave away her jacket, had reminded the universe of that truth. She did not know if she would wake up again, but if she did not, at least she had done something that mattered. At least she had been kind he could. For now, she just let them know they were not alone. The night was coming, and it would be the longest of her life. Turned off her flashlight and sat down slowly on the cold ground. She made herself as small as she could, and in the darkness of that frozen cave, surrounded by howling wind and endless ice, she made a choice. She was not going to leave them.